All right, Matthew chapter 5. We'll read verses 17 through 20. 17 through 20. Do not think that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law until all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of these least commandments and teaches men to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but he who does and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. So let's think about this statement of the Lord. It's one of a series of what we might say standalone texts in the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, it's not directly connected to anything right before it, but although somewhat right after it. And I want to get to that. But it certainly marks a change in thought and emphasis with how Jesus has begun this sermon in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 2. But I want to think about the statements that are found in for example, in verse 17 to begin. All right, he says, "Do not think." Do not think. Now, there are a couple of possibilities as to why Jesus might have said this. One is that, and we have to remember, the Sermon on the Mount is not Jesus' first sermon. It's not even close to being his first sermon. I mean, Matthew 4:17 says, "Then Jesus began to preach, saying, Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Then you get to verse 23, "Then Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease." So Jesus has already been in a circuit about Galilee preaching the kingdom. All right, and so he's preaching things that are certainly in the forethought of the Jewish mind, religiously speaking. Now, we have no idea what he had been saying prior to that, other than repent, for the kingdom of heaven's at hand. But we know that obviously there has to be more to his message than that. I suspect that what we read in the Sermon on the Mount constitutes to a great degree the very things he preached as he went about Galilee. Because we have in Luke 6, Jesus preaching essentially this same sermon, so far as the general gist of it, preaching this same sermon in Luke 6 in what's called the Sermon on the Plain. And so Jesus is preaching a particular body of knowledge or a particular body of doctrine. So I think it's very safe to say that Jesus preached a lot of what's in the Sermon on the Mount in that Galilean circuit, which means people are going to be talking about it, right? John the Baptist. John the Baptist had already been preaching, and people talked about John's preaching, right? John created a stir, and now Jesus comes and he's taking John's teaching he's taking it to the next level. And so obviously there's got to be some discussions going on about this new teaching. And what it reminds me of is when Paul went to Mars Hill, he was preaching about Jesus, and nobody ever heard anything about any Jesus. Nobody ever heard anything about a man being raised from the dead. And they're like, what is this new teaching that you're bringing us? All right? Same thing for the Jews. This is new teaching. And so there's the likelihood that there are rumors going around about what Jesus has been saying. All right. Now, let me just say this in a general way. All right, I hate to use the idea of rumors, but on a number of occasions, I've preached a sermon on what did the cross cost Jesus. All right, and one of the things that I mentioned in that is that Jesus gave up some things when he came to earth that he never did get back when he went back to heaven, and I can prove that. The Bible clearly teaches it, that Jesus is not right now what he used to be when he was in heaven before he came. He's not the same. And he's never ever going to be what he was before he came. Now, that may be the first time some of you have ever heard that, all right? And we can talk about that at a later date. But the point of the matter is, when you start saying things that people haven't heard or thought very deeply about before, then a lot of times misunderstandings can take place. And I had a friend of mine just this morning ask me a question because I had preached some of this material in Arkansas a couple weeks ago when I was in Arkansas about Jesus and what it cost him to go to the cross. But what my friend says, is this what you're saying? In other words, rather than go, and by the way, I really appreciate them contacting me, because rather than going out and just saying, well, Todd said this or Todd said that, they reached out to me and said, wait a minute, I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying in this sermon. But it doesn't always work out that way, does it? Yeah. People don't always ask for clarification before we go on to the next step and so I really appreciate that person reaching out to me and saying, look, I want to understand exactly what you're saying. All right, but in Jesus' case, it was very likely, man, there's no telling what people were saying about Jesus and his teaching, right? I mean, they said John the Baptist, they said John the Baptist had a devil because he didn't come eating and drinking. And he said, but you said about me, I'm a glutton and a wine bibber. So the rumors could have been circulating. And so Jesus may be making this statement as a means of answering some of the rumors that have been, by the way, and I could give you examples. Paul was misquoted in Romans chapter 3, verse 8. They slanderously report that we preach, let us do evil that good may come. Now, that's what they're saying about what I'm preaching. I'm not preaching that. But the rumor got out that he was preaching that. And so Jesus may be making this particular statement in verses 17 to 20 to squelch some misinformation that was floating around about what he'd been teaching as he made that Galilean circuit. And by the way, it's not necessarily or, it could be that Jesus was making this statement as an introduction and as a buffer to what he was fixing to say. Because when we get to verse 21, through the end of chapter, all the way from Matthew 5:21 all the way to the end of the chapter in verse 48, Jesus starts making statements contrasting what you've heard, but I say. Or, it is written, you've heard that it's written, but I say. And so, it might be the case that Jesus is like, look, before I tell you what I'm fixing to tell you in the next 15 minutes, you need to understand what my motive is not. No, this is not my motive. This is not my intent. You may have heard these things from others. This is not my intent. Because if you think about it, Jesus starts with, you've heard it's been said by those of old time, you shall not murder. But I say. You've heard this said by those of old time, you shall not commit adultery. But I say. You've heard this been said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say. You've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say. You see, over and over again through the rest of this chapter, Jesus is contrasting the new teaching with the old, and he wants to make sure that the people understand what his intentions are, and what's really going on. And what he's saying is, don't think that I'm come to destroy the law and the prophets. All right, destroy means to obliterate. Now, the word that is translated in this text has two similar but not exact meanings. Two similar, but in other words, and by the way, what I always tell you about words in the Bible, context determines meaning. Context determines meaning. So in other words, you can use the exact same word But if you use it in two completely different contexts, the word doesn't mean the same thing. For example, when the Bible says that we're not justified by works in one text, but it uses the same word, says, but we are justified by works in another text, we know that the works in those two texts are not the same, even though the words are the same. Context determines meaning. In this case, Jesus said, do not think that I'm come to destroy the law and the prophets. Now, hold your mark there. I'm gonna take my own advice and hold my mark here. All right? I'm taking it out of my Joshua 9 mark for tonight. And turn over to the book of 1 Thessalonians. No, that's not right. Give me a second. I'll find it. I was going to say 1 Thessalonians 2:15, but it's Ephesians 2:15. I'm sorry. Ephesians 2:15. And we have to read verse 14 to get to verse 15 because it's all one sentence. All right? Ephesians 2:14. For he himself is our peace, who has made both one and broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace. See that word abolished there in verse 15? Abolished. What's he talking about abolishing in that? He's talking about the Old Testament, right? He abolished it. All right? That's the same word. That's the same word that we find in Matthew 5, where he says, "Do not think that I'm come to destroy." In other words, don't misunderstand what I've come to do. I haven't come to destroy it, but there is a sense in which he did come to abolish it, right? But the question is, how did he abolish it? Thank you, Sean. He abolished it by fulfilling it. Right? Now, once that law was fulfilled, it became invalid, right? Yeah. It's finished. It's finished. And so we have to understand that there's a difference between destroying a thing and abolishing a thing. All right? Hunt, help me out. Which amendment was the Prohibition Amendment? Was it the 18th? Well, the 19th was the one that gave women the right to vote, right? So then maybe the 20th is the abolition? All right, we'll go with 18. All right? But now what? Is that amendment still good? Is the Abolition Amendment still good? Jeremiah, did you look it up on the magic box? So which was the abolition? The 18th. All right, look at me. All right, so the 18th Amendment abolished was the Prohibition Amendment. All right, but is it still active? The 18th is not active. The Prohibition Amendment is not active. Why? Why? Was it the 20th? The 21st. Because the 21st Amendment undid the 18th Amendment. Is that right? So the 21st Amendment abolished the 18th Amendment in a very real way, right? But did it destroy it? Still in the Constitution, isn't it? Is the 18th Amendment still in the Constitution? Still there, but it's not in effect. So it's not been destroyed, but has been abolished, right? Well, the same thing goes with the old law. It's not been destroyed. I mean, we still got it, right? It's still in the Bible, right? Is it still a valid part of the Bible? It certainly is. But the power of it has been taken away. Is that right? Has the power of the Old Testament been taken away? Sure it has. Does that mean the Old Testament's not inspired anymore? No. It just means something came along and undid it in a way. And so what Jesus is saying here about his relationship to the law and the prophets is, I didn't come to destroy them. I came to fulfill them. That's right. What we're just reading about in Ephesians 2. The old law kept men out of a particular relationship with the Lord. And so Jesus said, I got to come do away with that in order to reconcile both, Jew and Gentile in one body by the cross. And so I just want to spend some time thinking about the words here. All right? I didn't come to destroy it, but he did abolish it. But we still have it. And do we still need it? Yes, we do. Because whatsoever things are written aforetime, but for our learning. That's right. We still need the Old Testament. It's written for our learning. Paul quoted Paul made reference to the Old Testament in 1 Corinthians 10. These things happened to them as examples for us. And so we want to understand Jesus' relationship to the old law. Now let me add this, and I didn't intend to say this, but since it popped into my head, I'm going to throw it out there. And I'm going to say something that you might think is kind of a duh statement, but trust me, there's a point to it. Jesus lived under the old law, right? All of it, right? He agreed with. Let me ask you, did he agree with all of it? Did Jesus agree with all the old law? Did he agree with it? Yeah, he agreed with it because he lived under it and he wrote it. Is that right? It was God the author of the old law? I mean, Moses was the writer, but who was the author? God was the author. All right, so what does that mean? That means everything, and this just kind of as a quick aside, everything that the old law commanded in regard to punishments, Jesus was in agreement with it. That's a lot. A lot of people have a misunderstanding about Jesus and about how Jesus thought, and they haven't stopped long enough to figure out that Jesus lived under the old law. He was the giver of the old law, and as the giver of the old law, he agreed with every bit of it. That means the part about stoning and rebellious kids. Punishments for adultery, punishments for homosexuality, punishments for kidnapping. Jesus agreed with all of that. And so we can't let people present a misguided view of who Jesus is. Every time Jesus was in a situation in his personal ministry wherein a thing was commanded by the law, he commanded a person to do that. For example, when the lepers were cleansed, what did he say? Go show yourself to the priest and offer the offering that's commanded of you in the law. Notice, Jesus not only lived under the law, he commanded all people that were living under the law to continue keeping the law. He didn't say, hey, you don't have to live under this anymore because I got something better coming. You got to keep it till it comes. That's exactly right. You got to keep it till it comes. And that's the key of verses 17 and 18. Till heaven and earth pass away. Now look, Jesus didn't say that the old law and the prophets would continue until heaven and earth passed away. That's another misunderstanding people make about the text. Well, Jesus said till heaven and earth pass away. The law being... No, that's not what he said. He said until heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle, the very smallest markings in Jewish writing, kind of like we would call a jot the dot on the I. We're taught to, by the way, does anybody dot their I's anymore when you write? All right, well, but we're all old. We were all taught to do that. But people don't, when I'm writing my name, I dot my I by taking my D and just swirling it over to the top of the I. All right, that's me dotting my I. All right, that's the jot. And the tittle, I mean, obviously you got to cross your T's, right? Because if you don't cross your T's, they're L's, correct? All right, so that's what Jesus is talking about. The dot, he says, not one dot on the I or cross on the T is going to be done away with. What's the next word? Until all is fulfilled. So Jesus wasn't saying that the old law was to be observed into perpetuity. He just said none of it's going to be done away with until. Until what? All's been fulfilled. Now, then I got to thinking this morning and it made my head hurt. And I'm going to call Billy this week and talk to him about this, but I'm going to bounce this off of you first. Not one jot or tittle will pass from the law until all of it is fulfilled. That means all of it's in effect until it's all fulfilled, and then it's all what? Not in effect. Is that right? Question. Has all the law been fulfilled? Has it all been fulfilled? Sure it has, because it's been taken out of the way, right? I mean, we just read that in Ephesians 2. It's been taken out of the way. The old law's been taken out of the way. He nailed it to the cross. All right, and that's a perfectly valid description. All right? Now, if all of it's been done away, then number one, we cannot appeal to any part of it as a justification for our practices. Is that right? Again, and by the way, there's a difference. Now catch me now. There's a difference in using an Old Testament passage as an example of a thing and using it as justification for a thing. Do you follow me? So we can appeal to the Old Testament for examples, right? I mean, if Paul did it, I think we can do it. 1 Corinthians 10. We can appeal to the Old Testament, for example, about matters of worship as examples. Now, do we worship like Cain and Abel worship? No. But can we learn something about worship through the example of Cain and Abel? Offerings and everything. All right. Do we worship like Nadab and Abihu did in Leviticus chapter 10? No. But can we point to Nadab and Abihu to help us learn about what God thinks about worship? I'll give you another. 1 Kings 12 and 13, Jeroboam, he changed the place of worship. He changed the day of worship. He changed the priesthood of worship. He changed the object of worship. And man, did he ever. And the people paid for it. Now, I can learn from these things about examples, about what God thinks about His commands for worship, right? But I don't use the Old Testament to justify any act of worship, do I? So what's that going to preclude me from doing in a matter of worship? I'm not going to go to the Old Testament to justify what? Doing something in the New Testament worship that they did in the Old Testament worship. And what's the big one that everybody wants to jump to? Instrumental music and worship. They're going to jump to the Psalms or are they going to jump to the temple worship every single time? That won't work.
How people do today, instead of using the Old Testament as an example, they want to use it just like the New Testament. It has as much weight as the New Testament. That ain't right.
That's right. They fail to make a distinction between the covenants, which is interesting because I've been reading. I've got to preach at the Power Lectures in a couple of weeks, and I've been doing some research on Alexander Campbell. And Campbell got in a big problem with the Redstone Baptist Association at their convention or meeting because he preached a sermon on the division of the covenants. That the Old Testament was not to be used as a source of authority for New Testament practice. And eventually got him kicked out. My point is, what we take for granted as knowledge continues to be problematic for people today. They want to jump to the Old Testament for some justification of something that they want to do in the New Testament. So that won't work. But now let me take this one step further, and I'll close it out, and we'll come back to it, Lord willing, next week. I want to think for a moment about the prophets. And I'm throwing this out to you because, again, this is something that just hit me this morning, and I haven't had time to flesh it out. But I want a collective brain power, so to speak. Is there any Old Testament prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled? And that's what I think, Bob. I think the answer is no. Again, based on what Jesus says in this text and the fact that it's all been done away with, I think the only reasonable conclusion is what? Everything in the Old Testament, what? Has been fulfilled. Is that right? Is that a fair statement to make? Now, here's a couple passages that ran through my mind. Look in Luke 24. And look at verse 44. Luke 24, verse 44. What does Jesus say about the law and the prophets in this verse? These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things, what? Must be fulfilled, which are written where? In the law of Moses, and the prophets, and the Psalms. Is Jesus telling his apostles that the entirety of the law and the prophets and the Psalms have been fulfilled? That's what I think. That's what I think. You know, earlier in Luke's account, in Luke 16:16, Jesus said the law and the prophets were until John. And since that time, the kingdom of heaven is being preached. In other words, Jesus himself seems to mark kind of draw a line in the sand. In other words, the law and the prophets were to hear. Now here's the inauguration, here's the initiation of something new or different, a fulfillment. That's right, the fulfillment. In other words, these things were written, and now the fulfillment of these things is upon us. Now, here's where I was going with this in my mind when I was sitting at my desk this morning. Look, we all know that premillennial doctrine is hogwash. All right? We've studied it over and over and over and over again. We've studied every individual part of premillennial doctrine. The idea of a rapture, the idea of a worldwide tribulation, the idea of a singular antichrist, and the battle of Armageddon. Look, it's all hogwash, all of it. Yeah. By the way, it all came from John. I believe it was John Darby over in England in about the 1820s, based on some dream a teenage girl had. Now, you going to base a doctrine on the dream of a teenage girl? We're going to have some questions. All right? But here's my point. What do the proponents of premillennialism do to prove things that are not yet come? They go to the Old Testament. Isn't that right? Yeah. That's my point. They're going to jump back to Daniel. They're going to jump back to Ezekiel. They're going to jump back to Zephaniah or Zechariah. No, they're going to jump back into all these Old Testament prophets and try to build a case from the Old Testament prophets about things that they claim are what? Still yet in the future. That won't work, will it? Not by Luke 24:44. It won't work. And it's crazy. I mean, but I've been preaching 30 years, and this is the first time this ever hit me in the head, and it just hit me like a sledgehammer. Every time a premillennialist goes to the Old Testament as proof of things that have not yet come to pass, he's denying the very words of Jesus in Luke 24:44. Is that right? Now look, I don't want to lead anybody astray because, like I said, this thing, I've always known the Old Testament's been done away with, and I've always believed and known that the old law's been fulfilled. But it had never hit me like it did this morning. It's not just the Old Testament law. It's not just the Pentateuch. It's all of it. In other words, any prophecy that I read in the Old Testament of necessity has to have been fulfilled. And if it hasn't, then what? If there's any unfulfilled prophecy in the Old Testament, then what? According to Jesus in Matthew 5:17 and 18, we'll still be under it. Is that right? If any of it has yet to be fulfilled, we are still under it. Now, and the reason I know I'm on safe ground is because I've read the book of Hebrews. Right? I've read Hebrews chapter 8. If the first covenant had been faultless, there'd be no reason to seek out a second. The first one is growing old, waxing old, and ready to vanish away. Verse 13. Do not stand fast in the freedom wherewith Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again in the yoke of bondage. Galatians 5. Note, the New Testament is so filled with passages that are telling those people, and by extension us, that the Old Testament's been done away with. I know that I'm safe then in saying that all prophecies of the Old Testament have been fulfilled. And again, because Jesus said, none of it passes until all's fulfilled. By the way, did you think about this, Sean? The fact that Jesus started his first public sermon with, it'll all be enforced until it's all fulfilled. And then the last thing that he said is what? It's finished. It's all, and in Luke 24, it's all been fulfilled. I mean, that's a lot to think about. And again, and I don't think I've said anything new to you that you didn't already believe. At least I don't think I did. But maybe you've never thought about it. What I'm saying is, all the things that I'm telling you, I've known for the most part. But it just hit me like a sledgehammer this morning about the use of the Old Testament. Dennis, bring them on in. I'm done. It's too hot for them kids to stand out there waiting. They're soft. They ain't like us when we was kids.